Today, we're going to look at bonding in biological molecules. Now, there's several different types of bonds that occur in biological molecules, and we're going to start with the first one, which is covalent bonding. Carbon is able to covalently bond with hydrogen or other carbon molecules or certain other molecules. Now, carbon has 4 electrons in its outer shell. This is represented by the little crosses. The adjacent atoms will also give an electron to be shared between themselves and the carbon. This is represented by the tiny little circles. So when 2 electrons are between the 2 atoms, they share these electrons between them, and this will create the bond that keeps the atoms together. Now here we can see 2 amino acids. The R in my diagram represents the variable chain or part of the amino acid. So I'm only showing the parts that's involved in the reaction. Now in this reaction, the bond between the carbon and the oxygen and the nitrogen and the hydrogen will break, forming water. The water is then being released into the system. A bond will then form between the carbon and the nitrogen. This bond is called a peptide bond. These bonds are formed between the monomers amino acids to form proteins. Next, we have 2 glucose molecules. In these molecules, the bond between the carbon and oxygen and hydrogen will break, releasing water. A bond between the oxygen and carbon will then form, called a glycosidic bond. These bonds are formed when glucose molecules or any other carbohydrate monomers are joined together to form a carbohydrate polymer. Then a covalent bond can also form between a carboxylic acid and a glycerol, like in the formation of lipids. So here the carboxylic acid will be the fatty acid and the alcohol will be glycerol. Again, my R's is the rest of the molecules. I'm only showing the sides that interact. So the bond between oxygen and hydrogen and oxygen and carbon will break, forming water that will be released. A bond will then form between the oxygen and the carbon, and this bond is called an ester bond. Next, we have the formation of DNA. Now, our bases, as we know, can either be adenine, guanine, cytosine, or thymine. I didn't specify in this example because it wouldn't affect the reaction. Now here, the bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen and the carbon and the oxygen will break, forming water that will be released. This will form a bond between the carbon and the oxygen called a phosphodiester bond. The last covalent bond we're going to look at is a disulfide bond. Now here it happens in between amino acids that have a sulfur group in their R chains. The sulfur group will lose the hydrogens that would form hydrogen gas. A bond will then form between the sulfur atoms called a disulfide bond. These bonds are responsible for the tertiary structure of a polypeptide. The next type of bond we're going to have a look at is hydrogen bonding. Now, hydrogen bonding occurs in several molecules between a negatively charged oxygen and a positively charged hydrogen. Now, the negatively charged oxygen will attract the positively charged hydrogen, and this will create an electrostatic force of attraction between them, keeping the atoms together. This can happen between water molecules, between the hydrogen and the oxygen of the water molecule. It can also happen in DNA between the nucleotide bases, between the oxygen and the hydrogen and the nitrogen. For example, between thymine and adenine. It also occurs between guanine and cytosine. Then hydrogen bonding can also occur between molecules in proteins, between the hydrogen and the oxygen atoms of the different R groups. Lastly, it can occur between molecules and water. Again, this is between the hydrogen and the oxygen of the water molecules. This will cause the molecule to be soluble in water. Next, we have hydrophobic interactions, and this occurs when nonpolar molecules are submerged in water. The nonpolar molecules will point towards each other to try and get away from the water that surrounds them so that they do not interact with the watery surroundings. Lastly, we have ionic bonding, which occurs usually between metals and nonmetals. This is another example of an electrostatic attraction between a positively charged molecule and a negatively charged molecule. In this example, we can see that an extra hydrogen molecule is attached to nitrogen. This will give the molecule an overall positive charge. We can then see on the molecule next to it that there's a single bonded oxygen atom. This will cause the oxygen of this molecule to be negatively charged. The positive charge of the hydrogen and the negative charge of the oxygen will attract each other to create an ionic bond.